Thank you for joining me here for the Daily Bread Bible Study. This is day 235 for Saturday, August 22nd, 2020, focusing on Lamentations chapters 3 through 5. Now, we continue with the last part of Lamentations, a very short book, only 5 chapters long. And we see in Lamentations 3, the writer of Lamentations feels sad. In Lamentations 3:7, it says, "He has walled me about so that I cannot escape. He has put heavy chains on me. Though I call and cry for help, he shuts out my prayer. He has blocked my ways with hewn stones. He has made my paths crooked." Now, this is a very different scene than what we have in the 23rd Psalm, which says in verse 2 of Psalm 23, "He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil." Part of the issue is that he's just suffering very greatly. As I said, right now the siege of Jerusalem was a terrifying time. All sorts of just suffering and plague, lack of food, people dying. It was not a pretty sight. Babylon coming and choking out Jerusalem of all its resources, and then ultimately killing and taking people into exile was a horrific time for these people. There's definitely a reason why it's not the 23rd Psalm. It's much more like the 22nd Psalm, one of lament, my God, why have you forsaken me?" So here, part of this issue in the book of Lamentations is that, all these heartaches, lead to depression. So in Lamentations 3:17, the writer says, "My soul is bereft of peace. I have forgotten what happiness is." Now, I also want to take a moment to acknowledge a significant difference in the book of Lamentations and something that has also happened in the book of Job. Now, both of the book of Lamentations and the book of Job focus on the theme of suffering and where God is in the midst of that. But they say similar things. Coming up here in chapter 3 reminds me of Job 15, verse 17. "How happy is the one whom God reproves. Therefore do not despise the discipline of the Almighty." Now, the idea is very similar here in Lamentations 3, verse 27. "It is good for one to bear the yoke in youth and to sit alone in silence when the Lord has imposed it." The key difference between these two verses, even though they're speaking of, that suffering can have purpose, even in the midst of losing happiness, the writer of Lamentations claims that it could be good to sit in silence when the Lord has imposed it. These are two very different things, even though they say the exact same thing. The difference is in the book of Job, his friends were telling him that he should accept, this that is from the hand of God. And in the book of Lamentations, the writer is claiming it for himself. Now, when others tell you what you should feel, it can rob a person of being able to make meaning from their own suffering, to be able to process their own suffering too. It can force people to view their suffering as a way that they just can't process yet, right? It's hard to sit in the midst of suffering, and since human tendency is to want to either avoid it, to remove it, or to fix it, it just makes it complicated. Suffering is not as simple as just filling in a hole. It involves working through grief on someone else's timetable, especially the person who is suffering's timetable. So for Job's friends there in the book of Job, they were giving him all this wisdom and advice to tell him how he should get through his suffering. And yet ultimately Job labeled them as unhelpful friends, and in fact became his enemies because they were telling him things he just couldn't be able to handle in the moment. Whereas in the book of Lamentations, we see that the book of Lamentations, he's calling this all to his mind. He is, saying that it's okay that God would reprove him. It is okay that these things can happen because he knows that there will be hope. There's a hope that the writer does not currently experience, a truth that is beyond him, but yet it still comes to his forefront here in Lamentations 3:21. But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. He says this even while he's not experiencing it currently. This feels very familiar to the night of Jesus' crucifixion, where Jesus claimed things he wasn't able to feel at that moment in time. And then here we have similar words written in the book of Lamentations as to what Jesus experienced on the cross. Lamentations 3:27 says, "It is good for one to bear the yoke in youth, to sit alone in the silence of the Lord who has imposed it, to put one's mouth to the dust, to give one's cheek to the smiter, to be filled with insults." This imagery all comes up of Jesus there sitting as he is being mocked and spat upon, as he is suffering on the cross, saying, as people are mocking him as the King of the Jews. Yet he sits there in silence before Herod and before Pilate and Caiaphas and all the high priest and the leaders of the Jews who are hurling all these accusations against him. He chooses not to speak very much at all. I imagine there was dust on his mouth as well. And we heard and documented the bruises on his cheeks and the insults that were hurled as he was hanging on the cross. But just like Jesus, God does not leave those suffering without help. In Lamentations 3:57, "You came near when I called on you, and you said, 'Do not fear.' You have taken up my cause, O Lord, and have redeemed my life. You have seen the wrong done to me, O Lord. Judge my cause." Whenever we suffer, we know that there can be hope, yet it still is hard to experience in that moment, which is why in Lamentations chapter 4, verse 6, Jerusalem's suffering is compared with Sodom's. "For the chasteness of my people has been greater than the punishment of Sodom, which was overthrown in a moment, though no hand was laid upon it." Verse 9 continues, saying, "Happier were those pierced by the sword than those pierced by hunger, whose life drains away, deprived of the produce of the field." The people were suffering greatly there in the siege of Babylon, and unspeakable things, terrible things, of seeing people die and then trying to find ways to be able to provide nutrition for themselves so that they wouldn't perish. It was terrible, even worse than Sodom, which was destroyed in a moment. Moving on to Lamentations chapter 5, then after they're taken into exile, they remember that they are enslaved. In Lamentations 5 verse 4, "We must pay for the water we drink. The wood we must get must be bought." It's just another form of comparison to slavery in Egypt, and literally Egypt's name comes up here in verse 6. "We have made a pact with Egypt and Assyria to get enough bread." They are enslaved once again as God's people. Yet the overall feeling is sadness, as you can imagine. In Lamentations 5:15, "The joy of our hearts has ceased, our dancing has been turned into mourning." With all of this suffering and sadness, we end actually on a note of that God will help out. The last two lines of Lamentations reads as this: "Restore us to yourself, O Lord, that we may be restored. Renew our days as of old, unless you have utterly rejected us and are angry with us beyond measure." The reality is that God, in fact, brings his people back to the promised land after exile. and that after great suffering, God gives them great blessings. And they were able to build houses and live within them and plant vineyards and eat their fruit. They do not labor in vain. May you be able to see all your purposes come to an end, even through the midst of difficulty and suffering, and may God provide light and hope each and every day.